Welcome back to another episode of Gimme Some Truth. We have an exciting episode today. We have a guest on from Portugal, and Stan and I could not be more excited about it. We're going to get into all things Portugal, specifically NHR 2.0. Myself, Nate Condon and Stan in the booth with Zeev Fisher from Fresh Portugal. Stan, why don't you help people to understand when we became familiar with Fresh Portugal and how we work with them specifically?
Yeah, so I would say maybe 3 years ago, I became aware of Fresh just incidentally through discussions with a client that was using their tax services. And then over the last couple of years, their website has provided a lot of useful information about tax issues related to NHR, and then really caught my curiosity by kind of in the middle of this year. NHR went away at the end of 24, but really only in the past few months, have they really clarified what took its place, right?
Sure.
Which is what has become known as NHR 2.0, and Zeev's firm has done a great job of kind of clarifying how that program works as the information has finally come together from the government. They finally put together, its replacement program, its targeted program. So I'm very excited about having Zeev on today so that the viewership here can learn more about this.
Absolutely. Zeev, we like to say kind of tongue in cheek at Wachner Condon that if a client has a question that involves a $, we want them to ask us, or at least maybe we have some resources that can help them through looking at your website and all the things that you guys do by way of tax and legal and real estate immigration. I would say that maybe that's a fair statement to make for your firm as well. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely share a lot of knowledge, and maybe as a kind of a very quick introduction, all we do is expat work. Yeah. So I'm an expat myself. I'm originally Israeli and British. When I came to Portugal, I was the exact same position that our clients are now, and with the benefit of having a tax law background, I've sort of created this firm when realizing that expats need something very specific. And we have a lot of American clients that have, as you know, an additional complexity in having to comply with US tax rules. So I came working. I had my own practice, which was in the UK and the US at the time. So I had the same kind of income streams, had the PLLC. Try to get advice. It wasn't easy to find expat experts. So I've created a practice, and it's grown around that expertise, and specifically supporting expats as they came to Portugal. Initially, just doing tax. When we go to 3 tax lawyers, we realized that we should probably be doing immigration as well. And now it's kind of full service. Immigration, tax, estate planning, real estate, all surrounding the expat world. So we don't have domestic lines almost at all. I mean, there's a couple, but our whole practice is focused on supporting people coming to Portugal, investing in Portugal. Soon supporting people coming to the UK as well, but all on this cross-border aspect.
So help us understand the makeup of your firm. How many people, how many attorneys on staff? Maybe a little bit of a background.
We're 15 lawyers now.
Yeah.
And one US tax accountant based in the East Coast as well. So many of our clients, they also need direct US tax services. So we've added her, and she is absolutely fantastic. And 2 people in the UK. We're slightly over 20 last time I counted, and your lawyers in Portugal do slightly different type of expat tax work than sometimes people. For example, we file tax returns. We file a lot of expat tax returns, and lawyers do that. And in the US, it would be a CPA's job. And in Portugal, accountants will file tax returns if they are domestic, local tax returns of people working domestically. But if you need to claim an exemption based on the legislation, or if you need to claim treaty benefits, it's usually a lawyer's job, and we have a team doing that now. So about half of us are tax people, and the rest are different other disciplines.
Absolutely. Stan, you and I were talking about, before we got started here, some of the unique challenges that people face when they move to Portugal. As somebody that lived there yourself, I mean, what are some of the things that are unique to people, going to Portugal to continue their lives?
Well, obviously, marginal tax rates are higher in Portugal than federal U.S. tax rates.
Sure.
But surprisingly, if you live in a place like California, and you're paying state taxes and you're paying federal taxes, maybe it's not such a change. But obviously, one thing that Americans face is legally getting admitted into the country, right, as a resident. Right. And I mean, that's not different than a lot of other countries. But in fact, Portugal is somewhat famous for being attractive because it's an easier process than most. But that doesn't make it easy. And I get the feeling that maybe it's not getting any easier as Portugal has had great immigration success, right? That now
a good problem to have.
Yeah, exactly. Now maybe it's going to become a little more challenging, and just the sheer numbers of immigrants obviously is a stress on their government immigration force, right, to be able to accommodate appointments and so on and so forth. The second thing is obviously if you can, if there are economic incentives, if there are tax breaks or a tax period where you kind of don't have to pay all of your Portuguese taxes on non-Portuguese sourced income, like under the traditional NHR, and now under this new program, which has now been dubbed NHR 2.0. But trying to understand and then actually having to fill out the forms and apply and be approved for such a program. Which, by the way, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Zeev, but this only occurs after you've attained residency.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
So you have to get you have to get the immigration accomplished first, move there, and then apply for it and hope
that you get it.
Right.
Yeah, Zeev, I don't want to spend a great deal of time on the original NHR because it's not a thing anymore, but I do think that it provides good context for the conversation that we're going to have today regarding what we're kind of affectionately referring to as 2.0. I know that it's much more targeted under the new iteration than the original, but can you help us just understand kind of the ins and outs of the first NHR and kind of what that did, and then as we kind of move into again what we refer to as 2.0.
Sure. Yeah. So there was a financial crisis in Portugal about 15 years ago, which it dug itself out in a few ways. One of them was introducing the NHR program to invite foreigners or non-Portuguese people that have good incomes to come to Portugal and not be subject to Portuguese standard taxation, which is really designed around typical Portuguese salaries that are much lower than typical American or British or even the center of Europe salary. So you get to the high tax brackets quite quickly. And that was a barrier for people to come. So they've designed a program that exempts some of that income or gives a preferential rate for some of that income in order to encourage people to come and spend money and pay tax in Portugal. And that's to some extent, this program has been the victim of its own success because it really has succeeded beyond expectation. It became one of the most known programs in the world. It was copied by other countries, and the general idea, and it's quite of an interesting and innovative idea at the time, was that if you are subject to tax in another country, then you wouldn't pay tax in Portugal on that income. And it's kind of operates in an interesting way for Americans that are always subject to tax in the other country, unlike other nationalities. So, for example, Americans, for example, were the only ones exempt from capital gains on securities in Portugal. No other nationality had that benefit, and it's kind of in one of the few cases where being an American is actually a good thing for taxes. But it's I mean, yeah, and you mentioned immigration and it's being hard, or I think maybe taking a step back. I think if people are considering Portugal, before they are thinking about kind of the specifics of how exactly does the immigration process work, it's very important to understand that Portugal has a very different culture than the US. It's not going to be the same culturally. Things don't work in the same way. I mean, I often tell people that the US, also the UK, are very similar in that sense, are rule-based societies. So you have like a guide, you have a piece of paper telling you how things are going to work, and then you follow that piece of paper, and whatever that paper says, this is what happens. And who you are doesn't make much of a difference, or at least it's not supposed to. And things generally apply in a fairly predictable way to a specific group of people. Whereas Portugal is a South European country, and it's much more relationship based, and there's a huge amount of discretion. So there is a difference in the outcomes in Portugal. First, if you know the right people, it's if you have inways into the right to a friendly immigration officer or a positive tax person, you could have a different outcome than someone else who doesn't know which immigration or finance office to go to, regardless of what the paper might say. And there's also a big difference in attitude based on how you behave. So the Portuguese really don't like people demanding and complaining things, which is a lot of people come with sort of a client-centric approach of, if I'm unhappy about something and I'm going to voice my unhappiness and say, oh, you're not treating me very well, I'm going to be treated better. And it does work in other places, but in Portugal, it typically achieves the exact opposite thing. And if you start complaining, they don't like it, and they will ignore you on purpose to punish you. Whereas if you're nice and friendly, you usually get much further. And some of it is language, at least to make the effort to learn the language and communicate. But it's a lot of it is just a matter of attitude. So people have very different experiences in the immigration and tax system in Portugal based on kind of who they know, who represents them, and how they act. And some people will say that it's a nightmare, and some people will say that it's paradise, and they're both true. But yeah, I mean, it is slow. That's globally true. Most things are take a long time in Portugal. People have to be very patient here.
So I'm curious with.
It does work out eventually for most.
So I'm curious with that comment, and then moving into 2.0. How has 2.0 been shaped by that kind of the way that they handle society in terms of the more targeted nature of 2.0 and not being so broad? Can you just speak a little bit on kind of how those two ideas come together?
Yeah, so NHR was a huge success, but it did create some pressure from mainly from honestly people that didn't understand the benefits to society from bringing in highly qualified people and people on high salaries. Lots of things that locals think about the NHR program are sometimes just not very true, and sometimes are just completely false. There was also the Golden Visa program, right, where they got real estate out of the Golden Visa program, and people still think that the Golden Visa is raising real estate prices, which is completely unrelated at this point, but it's just this perception. And the kind of the underlying perception that trickled down to much of the population is you have all of these rich people coming to Portugal to live a cheap life and where their money goes further, but the result is that the prices are rising for everyone else, and then we Portuguese can no longer live in our cities, and we have to move out. And there's some truth in that, but it's obviously a much more complicated issue, and the house prices and other prices are impacted by lots of things, and you have to take into account net benefit. But it's we're in the age of populism, and all complicated issues are simplified into very simple narratives, and at some point there's just been too much opposition in the local population to all these rich people coming to Portugal and paying no tax, which none of this is true. Most people pay a lot more tax than under the NHR than the average Portuguese worker, but it has been part of the perception. And the previous government was a socialist government, so there was like, okay, this is done what it should have done, and we're going to scrap that. And their initial intention was to just completely cancel the program. So they just announced we're going to do NHR no more, and then all the industry came to the government and basically said, look, you can't do that because it will destroy the industry here. We need people to, no one's going to want to come here if they're earning good salaries. So we need to do something. And within maybe 2 or 3 weeks, there was different lobby groups from different areas were pressuring the government to add all sorts of exceptions to and carve out incentives for specific individuals and specific groups. And the outcome is a change in the law that's introduced 7 different groups that can benefit from something that's very similar to the NHR benefits. And there's sort of different pillars. And to make it even more complicated, each one of these groups is regulated by a different entity. So in the past, when you came to Portugal, you just tick the box and you have NHR done. Now you apply for NHR 2.0 and on the tax authority's website, the same place. And then it's been based on what your application is based on and which group you are a member of. This is being sent to the relevant regulating entity, which should check your supporting documents and whether your application is justified. Announce it, let the tax authorities know. Then it goes back to the tax authority, and the tax authority checks some other criteria, and that you haven't been a tax resident for the last 5 years, and they're supposed to approve it. But because they're overwhelmed as always, and they don't quite know what to do, they're generally sitting on all the applications now until the last minute, and they will be approving everything they need to on the last minute, because that's how it always works. So it's like a very complicated process that it was created through a last minute political pressuring. It's not, and it also took them, as Stan said before, it took them a while to put together the proper instructions. So the law has changed 2 years ago, but the tax authorities have only written a proper document explaining the instructions in the beginning of this year. The document is not 100% aligned with the law. So some parts of what the tax authority is requesting are actually not supported by the law, and they're likely to be knocked out in subsequent litigation at some point in the future. And that's completely normal in Portugal. So it's kind of like, yeah, we're just sort of hacking it out as they go along, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's shaping up would be the right way to describe it.
Yeah. Stan, what are we hearing, conversations you're having with prospective clients that want to move to Portugal, clients that are in Portugal? I mean, what is the viewpoint that they have on 2.0? What questions do they have? What concerns? I mean, how is it being perceived to this point?
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, it doesn't come up very often.
Really?
Right. I feel like there aren't that many people who are going there in early retirement or, going to be drawing on pensions. It's kind of the one area of income, Zeev, that's been kind of, altogether excluded from the new program, right? So they don't feel like it applies to them.
Sure.
But I also feel that because it's complicated, as Zeev said, and they're looking for these certain types of persons, what's being ignored is the potential to get this capital gains benefit and possibly this self-employment or consulting, or employment from abroad benefit to have some of this excluded or the tax lowered. Perhaps as an investor in some of these areas that are covered under NHR 2.0, which is why I found, the Fresh Portugal website enlightening, right? Because they talk about the ability that you don't necessarily have to be a professor, a scientist,
Sure,
an engineer,
yeah,
to benefit from 2.0, but you do have to be, you do have to start a company. Otherwise you need to start a company or work for, a government company in energy or something like that. But you could start up a company and really, if you, say you were a lawyer, right,
Mhm.
and you were retiring, right? That's not something you're going to do, right?
right,
But there's the potential for you to invest some of that nest egg in a startup company, in something that is targeted and desired in the Portuguese community, or to be a venture capitalist, if you will, right?
Yeah,
And that is unique to this program, I think, and it's something that, at least in the sample size of people reaching out to me, very very few people are aware of, or it's not the motivation that's
Yeah.
got them attracted. Whereas with NHR 1.0,
Sure.
the program itself was the attraction. And I think right now there's just not a general understanding of that NHR 2.0 could still be available to a wider audience. They see it as too targeted, and so they're going there with the idea that, well, I'm going to pay these taxes, but I want to live there because Portugal still has a lot to offer.
Yeah. Zeev, could you dovetail on some of Stan's comments in regard to potential pitfalls, things like that with 2.0, or maybe even pitfalls, maybe not the right word, but areas where it could potentially benefit somebody that isn't obvious on their first look at 2.0?
Yeah, so as Stan mentioned, so retirement income is completely exempt. It's completely out of the program. So even if sorry, not exempt, it's out of the program. So you can't get an exemption for money drawn from retirement accounts, but you can draw money from retirement accounts before you move and put them in standard investment accounts. So even kind of retirement money is something that you can play around with and prepare it before you come. Everything other than retirement accounts, including investment accounts, can be excluded under NHR 2.0, and also some income from work if it's an income from a business that's based outside of Portugal as well. So what we're seeing is before the law changed, most of our clients were kind of middle class and upper middle class people making anything between 150,000 to 350,000 and more a year, and active work, and all of them applied for NHR and did some structuring if relevant to improve their tax position. Now our typical client is kind of somewhat wealthier, so has portfolios of securities perhaps, and because the securities are the hardest hit when you move. The capital gains tax in the US is a lot lower than the capital gains tax in Portugal. Also, selling real estate, the capital gains tax in Portugal is higher. So people that have significant securities portfolios, and this is particularly relevant for Americans, because Americans traditionally build their wealth in the markets. In the capital markets. So if people have these security portfolios and they want to draw out of them at some point, or use some of that money to live, then whether they have the tax benefit or not is very relevant for them. But if they don't intend to work in Portugal or do anything in Portugal at all, it's kind of not obvious to them that they might be able to qualify at all, because the way that this kind of shifted is, okay, NHR 2.0 now requires you to have a qualifying position in a Portuguese company. And where we've taken this is towards, okay, a qualifying position in a Portuguese company includes a board member in a Portuguese startup. And this is something that I'm personally passionate about, because I've been investing in tech startups even from before I moved to Portugal, and when I came to Portugal for pure gain and supporting the ecosystem. I like to do it. So, and I always wanted to support the local tech ecosystem. And a lot of our clients are in this position. They just don't know anything about what's going on in Portugal and what's being developed and what are the local companies doing. But when they realize that there is an opportunity here, and also some really good companies with really good valuations, and there's something to be done in the local ecosystem. And also, if you become a board member in a Portuguese startup, it will qualify you for the new tax benefit scheme. Suddenly, anyone can invest in a startup company and take a board position. I mean, it's not natural for everyone to do it. Some people feel that it's a little bit awkward, but it can be done in principle. And a lot of people are very familiar with this VC type or angel investment type environment from the US. They just never thought about applying it in Portugal because there was no particular incentive or reason or facilitation, but now there is. So when we saw how the law changed, and we've spent quite some time on this, we thought, well, this is actually a fantastic opportunity to solve one of the biggest problems in the tech ecosystem in Portugal, which is the early stage checks. So there's actually a lot of money in Portugal for late stage technology companies, but to get the first 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 euro checks is something that kills a lot of Portuguese companies before they even have the chance to take off. So it's something that the government is aware of, and that Portugal is actively working on. So we thought, well, we have very talented people coming to Portugal all the time with relevant connection, experience, knowledge, and capital on one hand. On the other hand, there is a tax benefit that can make it a no-brainer for them if their security portfolios are such that the individual tax benefits will exceed by far the cost of getting involved in the local ecosystem. This is a clear win-win. And we've been talking to the local industry here, incubators, Startup Portugal, all the stakeholders in the tech ecosystem in Portugal are ecstatic about this. I mean, when we tell them, well, do you know, there's actually a group of Americans in Portugal with a huge amount of skill, interest, and capital that want to get involved and now are encouraged to get involved by tax benefits. They go, yeah, let's go, let's do it. So this is part of what we do. We facilitate this. It's not the typical thing for a law firm to do, but yeah, we're not typical.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to wrap up, Zeev. I think the information that you've given has been incredibly valuable today. And I think I want to call back to one thing you mentioned early on in the conversation, which was, especially in Portugal, if you're not working with qualified people, if you're not working with people that understand how to get things, from point A to point B, if you're not working with firms and professionals that really kind of understand the culture and more specifically understand a new iteration like 2.0, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. And I think that that's a really big call out for people that have interest in Portugal or even exploring the idea at some point, I want to move to Portugal. What's my first step? The first step would be to contact people like our firm and people at Zeev's firm, because without that knowledge, you could really put yourself in a bad spot and start that new chapter of your life on the wrong foot. And so I think that that's very, very good information. We talked before we started today of maybe even having additional podcasts with Zeev on or members of his team. And I think that that's going to happen because I think there's really good information that we didn't cover today that we'll absolutely cover in future podcasts.
I mean, we could certainly delve more into detail in the different ways that you can contribute to startups in a direct way or through a pooled way. Yeah. And then obviously discuss how some of those pooled ways might run afoul of U.S. tax situations. But I know that Zeev's firm has worked hard to develop a solution that is specifically tailored for Americans.
Absolutely. Zeev, thank you so much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it. We'll be back and do another one of these at some point in 2026.
Assuming Zeev's down with that. Right?
I hope so. I'm assume closing it, and
it's so American. We're just like, hey, you're going to do this for us, or we're going to complain. Okay.
Thank you very much, and yeah, definitely very happy to come back. And I mean, we only covered a little bit of ground, but we can definitely very happy to come back and do it again.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Zeev.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for watching another episode of Gimme Some Truth.
Condon Financial Advisors is a registered investment advisor with the SEC. Registration with the SEC does not imply a certain level of skill or training. The opinions expressed by the participants of this podcast are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Condon Financial Advisors. All statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. Information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. Thanks for listening, and for further information, please visit WalknerCondon.com.